Hello there and welcome to our special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file. After nearly 6 weeks of fighting, the world is still trying to figure out who is winning the Russia-Ukraine war that has seen thousands dead, millions displaced and multiple cities wrecked. When Russia's President Vladimir Putin sent his tanks and troops to Ukraine on February 24th, there was nothing official to suggest a time frame within which he wanted to achieve his goals. But his mightier military was widely expected to force Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky's troops to surrender soon. That has not happened. Ukraine is in fact retaking territories as Russia seems to abandon its operation in the north, where it did cause much destruction in the face of still Ukrainian resistance, and moves to the east where its complete focus lies. Russia's invasion has pushed Zelensky deeper into the embrace of the West that has ensured Ukraine is more weaponized. This is what Putin was most upset about. But who is actually winning the Russia-Ukraine war, and where is this going? These questions and more others will be discussed with other panel of guests. We have Philippe Wolnitz, political analyst, university lecturer from France, and Dr. Hamoud Salhi, associate dean professor from the US. Thank you, gentlemen, for accepting to be with us. The show begins right after this break.
Oh.
Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Can you hear me, Dr. Hamoud Salhi?
Now I can, Sir Karim. Thanks.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Let me start with you with this question. In the north, Putin's forces could never enter Kiev. They have now withdrawn from around Ukraine's capital and have moved across the border into Belarus and Western Russia, according to the Institute for the Study of War cited by BBC. Ukraine is retaking large parts around Kiev as about half a dozen burnt-out Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers lie in the region. Ukraine has also recaptured substantial areas around the city of Chernihiv that's located between Kiev and Russia. Such scenes are not uncommon now. What can we get from this? Did Russia lose this war?
Well, we have to put it in perspective. What we are seeing now is media reports originating from Western side. As you know, the Russian media has been sort of cut off in the entire region. So what appears to us is there is a movement on the Ukrainian side. They are making progress in controlling some of the territories. But the question remains whether this position that the Russians have taken is strategic, because the Russians perhaps want to stay away from establishing themselves in a country for a long time. They don't want to see another presence like the one they've seen in Afghanistan. In addition, it does seem that they are concentrating on other areas. And the other thing, as we have seen all along, that the strategy that the Russians have adopted at this point was to stay put and use airplanes and missiles and air forces powers to take control of the region. So in many ways, it is difficult to put this in a perspective of winning and losing, but certainly it has the impression, or the impression that this is Russian withdrawal, and that Ukrainians are taking control of the territories that they lost before.
Thank you indeed. Professor Philip Wolnitz, what's your comment on the recent development of the Russia-Ukraine file? How do you see a way out of this complicated and thorny file? Is it Russia ending the war, or is it just a regroupment?
Yeah, it's difficult to give a concrete answer because nobody is on the working there. It's the intelligence issue. And what we know about this is that there are many Russian losses, more than Ukrainian, and a lot of destruction. And maybe the initial aim of Russia was not to occupy completely Ukraine, but just to get back a part that Russia considers to be Russian. So it's very difficult to know how this will end. We are not prophets, and what I mean is...
Sure, but we can just analyze what's happening on the ground, that's why.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Very clear. Now, let me share with you this info. In a speech posted on his Facebook page, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the work to clear the rubble in Bordyanka, a town northwest of Kiev recently recaptured by the Ukrainians from the Russians, has begun, and that the situation there is much more horrible than in Bucha, where massacres of civilians have been committed, according to Ukrainian authorities.
The work began with the analysis of the blockade in Brodyanka. It's much more horrible there, even more victims of Russian occupiers. What will happen? What the world learns from the whole truth about the Russian army did in Mariupol, there in almost every street, is what the world saw in Bucha and other cities of the Kiev region after the withdrawal of Russian troops, cruelty, the same terrible crimes.
I get back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. In such accusations, we need strong evidence, of course. And the West are saying that satellite images of murdered civilians match videos recorded weeks later of bodies at the roadside. For them, these are providing compelling evidence of Russian war crimes, convincing Western leaders to ramp up sanctions on Russia and accelerate weapon supplies for Ukraine. My question being, how will this affect the final outcome of the war?
Well, this is indeed a situation that should not be tolerated. Now, we have to also understand that there is a process within the International Criminal Court, within the International Court, the United Nations, that seems to be overlooked at this point. These massacres are reported based on the media. So what we are doing, we are reacting to this media. The process is usually in the United Nations, as we have seen it on many other cases, where you have to establish facts on the ground, connecting the parties who are culprit in this situation. Now, what we are seeing at this point is a media focused on showing the atrocities of what's happening in Ukraine, highlighting the violation of human rights, making alleged accusations against Russia. This is designed to get the world attention and act forcefully to put an end to the war and hold, presumably in this case, Russia as responsible for these actions. In another context, we also have to be very careful in not following what I call due process, meaning that the institution of the international institution must be cognizant of the fact that such situations or such tragedies have to be reported and analyzed and investigated before allegations are presented. So at this point, we have not followed that process, be it for what we've seen the vote in the United Nations or in other areas. We are driven by a need to put an end to this war and using facts on the ground, irrespective of their source, validity, or whatever it is, focusing on what we're seeing on the ground. And what we're seeing on the ground is horrible and is horrific. And this is what the war is all about. So this is to put a pressure on the Russians to come to a resolution of the conflict, and in ways that would hold them responsible before the international institution. That facts need to be sort of investigated and looked at seriously.
Thank you indeed. Professor Philip Wolnitz, can we agree here that it is evident at a time when Ukraine is urgently seeking any additional leverage as Russian forces regroup for a new offensive, is that Russia's actions in Bucha are strengthening Ukraine's hand?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that there is a military issue and there is a media issue. And the way media are reporting on these events, the horrible things we saw, means Russia is losing ground, not only in the military way, but on the moral way. And that is very bad for Russian image in the world. But I think they don't care about this, and Russia still has some strong partners, economical partners, and it will be very difficult to have a response at the UN towards Russia, because Russia is in the Security Council, and some countries will be on the side of Russia. So it's clear, it's plain, that Russia has lost the image war, and by its cruelty and by the evidence of its cruelty in war. But I'm not sure it will lead to an international condemnation.
Mm-hmm. Very well indeed. Now, let's move on to a related matter. Foreign ministers participating in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or as known as NATO, meeting in Brussels, expressed their solidarity with Ukraine in the face of the Russian special operation and affirmed their union regarding sanctions against Russia. Let's follow this report and we continue our discussion right after.
Providing arms to Ukraine was the topic mostly discussed during the Atlantic Alliance meeting in Brussels, where the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba asked NATO countries for weapons now, or it will be too late.
Either you help us now, and I'm speaking about days, not weeks, or your help will come too late. And many people will die. Many civilians will lose their homes. Many villages will be destroyed, exactly because this help came too late.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that allies provide a wide range of different weapons systems and emphasized the importance of using these arms for defense.
Allies are providing a wide range of different weapon systems, both Soviet-era systems, but also modern equipment, and I think that this distinction between offensive and defensive is a bit strange, because we speak about providing weapons to a country which is defending itself.
At the end of the NATO meeting, the head of the American diplomacy, Antony Blinken, declared that it is likely that Russian forces will commit more atrocities in the areas they occupy in Ukraine.
With each day, more and more credible reports of rape, killings, torture are emerging. And for every Bucha, there are many more towns Russia has occupied and more towns it is still occupying.
During the meeting, many non-NATO countries, mainly Scandinavians, stressed that they are studying all options in order to protect their people, including joining NATO due to security concerns.
I get back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. NATO countries have been gradually stepping up their supply of weapons to Kiev. In doing so, Western nations are quietly crossing the defensive-only threshold set by leaders at the start of the crisis. But the question remains whether the gradual escalation in arms deliveries can avoid a Russian retaliation and turn the tide on the battlefield, where Moscow is seeking to wage a more conventional military-on-military war in the eastern Donbass. How do you see this, Dr. Hamoud Salhi?
Well, there are a few things that need to consider. So the NATO is very becoming more and more involved in this war by supplying a certain type of arms. And in that perspective, the NATO officials have shown their full support to the Ukraine. They also are very much concerned about how Russia would interpret this. This is why there is this distinction and constantly referring to the NATO as a defensive organization, that the weapons that they are being sent are of a technological advancement or types not very advanced, or in a sense they are defensive for defensive purposes, and that again they also try to show that there is no distinction between what is a defensive and an offensive weapon, and this is more a signal to the Russians, telling the Russians, look, we are going to provide this kind of weapons with a limited capabilities, so we don't want you to rush and to take this as a NATO full endorsement against Russia. These are very, very serious statement. It's and clarification. It's also intended to put pressure on the Russians to reach a compromise or to come to the negotiation table with the understanding that the positions that the United States is having on this war and the Russians are still far apart. In other words, the Russians are talking about providing guarantees. The United States and its allies are continuously talking about putting more sanctions, finding ways of arming the Ukrainian. But in the end, the challenge, or what the NATO member, what the Ukraine has a problem in a sense, that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore that continues to be a drive or a call that the Ukrainians are trying to get protections from the NATO. How the Russians will interpret this, it depends on how what is the future of this war and where it's going. So much of this is intended to put pressure, as I said earlier, on the Russians, and also responding to the calls that the Ukrainian leadership has been asking the United States, the Europeans, the NATO forces, Asian countries like Japan and others to come to their assistance and to make it clear from their perspective that this must be done now, not tomorrow, or specifically done yesterday. In other words, it has to be done quickly and in a manner that would help them overcome the challenges that they are facing on the battlefield.
Thank you so much. What about you, Professor Philip Wolnitz? Ukraine's military spent the first 6 weeks of the war trying to pick off invading Russian armored columns with light infantry using anti-tank bazookas. Poor Russian tactics and Ukrainian determination successfully forced the overstretched attackers to abandon their attacks on Kiev and Chernihiv and even Sumy in the northeast. But Ukraine now has to deal with Russian forces in the east and south that have made more defensive gains and are better dug in. How do you think NATO can help further?
Yeah, of course, NATO is a part of the solution, but I would like to say I don't agree completely with Professor Salhi. I think NATO is also a part of the problem. If you consider the Russian point of view, there was a kind of, how shall I say, suffocating sensation by Russians that they are surrounded by NATO countries. And of course, Ukraine's president is using this situation to get into NATO, but I'm not sure it would be a really good deal for NATO because it would be a higher tension with Russia to have really a NATO country at the border of Russia. So, of course, NATO can and should help Ukraine to defend itself, but maybe we should not accept, when I say we, I mean Western world, should accept all the questions or all what Ukraine wants. So it's a bit different seen from America, but as a Western European, I think it should be better to have a neutral zone, as it was proposed by President Jacques Chirac's counselor, Maurice Gourdeau-Montagne, about 15 years ago. And French politics proposed to have a neutral country in between Russia and NATO countries. And Russia accepted this point of view, and America and the United States rejected it in 2006. So maybe delivering arms, weapons, and heavy weapons, not defensive weapons, wouldn't be the right solution, and even put the tension much more higher.
What could be the right solution, Philip Walnut, since you're criticizing this, and you're saying that NATO is part of the problem, which is understandable because Russia was against the build-up of NATO or any bases near its borders. But then what can we do to resolve this crisis? Or is this intentional? Are we going to see this war lingering on even further?
No, of course we have to help Ukrainian population, and defensive means and financial help can be given to Ukraine, but there are some levels which should not be, some steps which should not be done, because then we have really a critical situation and on European ground. Because
so it's as though you're saying that there are certain red lines that are being crossed. Professor Hamoud Salhi, do you agree with our distinguished guest, Philip Walnut?
I think we have to unpack what is happening and where we are at this situation. Dr. Philip is correct in stating that there are some conditions there that would need to be looked at seriously. So the unpacking could be first is to look at the crisis as a Ukrainian-Russian crisis, meaning that the Ukrainians must have a say in a resolution, and the resolution that the Ukrainian would have been, and this could have been a long time ago when the crisis started, is to tell Russia and to tell the European, look, we don't want to get involved in this war or any kind of antagonizing any one of you. Let us be neutral. Let us be like Switzerland or another country, and that position would have been made very, very clear, and with the intent that the Ukrainian will resolve their national interests. Of course, there is the Crimea issue there that existed, that was lingering from so many years and continues. That should be also looked at separately, maybe going back to the Minsk treaty and implemented it, because the Ukrainian and the Russians, and alongside with other partners, have reached a solution or an agreement. The problem with the Minsk agreement, it was never implemented for obvious reason. It was vague. It was a temporary solution to a crisis. So there is Ukraine, which is playing a major role. Now, the other unpacking, which is very, very important, is United States and Russia. And this war is dictated by these two countries, meaning that agreement between Zelensky Zelensky meeting Putin would be irrelevant in more ways than one, because Zelensky has to take into consideration what the European countries and United States are dictating. So to unpack the second part, which is US, Russia, there you have several scenarios. One, when we hear what President Biden has declared so far, he's talking about a regime change. He's talking about overthrowing Putin regime. He's calling Putin a war criminal.
Yes, which is a dangerous escalation. And we see that as though the US has a positive side in this, in escalating the situation. What do you think, Philip Wolnitz? Is the US part of the problem, just like NATO is?
Well, it's not it's not the same part as Russia, of course, but as we see, America, United States drew back from Europe and now are coming back. There are also some economical issues because, of course, the dependence on Russian gas was a high economical dependence, and it's also a good business for the Americans to be back in Europe. So we have to consider this. I just want to remind you that Berlin is about 900 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So sometimes we forget this, and it's far away from the United States. So the real problem is I would like to say, on our ground, on European ground, and not in the USA. So US consider the problem from a strategical point of view and from economical point of view. But the problem, if I may say so, we have it with the Russian refugees, with the economical issues.
Yeah, so the direct
Germany
repercussion will be on Europe and European countries. Very, very clear indeed. Also, in an important development, the United Nations General Assembly suspended Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Thursday, citing accusations of gross and systematic breaches and abuses of human rights in Ukraine, forcing Moscow to withdraw from the council. Let's follow this report, then we discuss further.
Russia has been suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Thursday after 93 members voted in favor of the diplomatic rebuke at a meeting of the UN General Assembly. The 193-member assembly passed a resolution supported by the US, suspending Russia's position in the UN Human Rights Council for gross and systematic abuses of human rights. A two-thirds majority of the assembly members voted yes, which met the requirements of votes, while 24 were against and 58 abstained. The American ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield welcomed a historic moment at the end of the session.
Right now, the world is looking to us. They are asking if the United Nations is prepared to meet this moment. They're wondering if we are a platform for propaganda and a safe haven for human rights abusers, or if we are prepared to live up to our highest ideals enshrined in the UN Charter. Today, the international community took one collective step in the right direction.
Russia's deputy ambassador urged members to vote against the resolution and rejected the untruthful allegations against Russia. This is the first time a country has been expelled from the United Nations Top Human Rights Council since Muammar Gaddafi's government was overthrown in 2011. Based in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council consists of 47 members, and under the 2006 resolution that established it, the General Assembly can suspend any country from membership if it commits gross and systematic violations of human rights.
I get back to you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, and in relation with the same development, Algeria voted on Thursday at the United Nations General Assembly against the decision to suspend Russia's membership in the Human Rights Council at the United Nations organizations. In a statement, Algeria explained its position against the UN decision. The Algerian ambassador to the UN said that Algeria reaffirms its firm attachment to the fundamental rules and principles of the international humanitarian law and the international human rights law. So, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, can you explain to us the position of Algeria and such countries who voted against briefly, because we're running out of time, please?
Very briefly. There are what we talked earlier. There's a process that is sort of missing here, which is United Nations General Assembly has a right to vote on membership, but it has that vote has to be based on facts and investigation. We have not done that. So that from that one. The second thing is that when you look at the votes, it's split when you add the abstention and against, meaning that and when you look at the countries that are sort of abstained or were against this, these are countries that don't want to be involved in this conflict, or to be more cautious, is to look at the war from their national strategic perspective, bearing in mind the complexities of this conflict, meaning that the Algerian position is in line with its national interest, with its principles. And Algeria has been very clear from the start by stating that it will sort of ensure that the international law is respected, but also the process is followed. There is also a third point that we should have.
Yes, Hamoud Salhi, because we're running out of time, I'm sorry to cut your train of thoughts. I would like to give a very brief bottom line conclusion for Philip Willits about this development quickly in, let's say, 20 seconds, please.
Okay, in 20 seconds, the real problem is the refugee problem, and which is different or is differentiated from a migrants problem. And this is the real scandal, long-time scandal, which is happening now, just beside the war in Ukraine.
Very, thank you. Very clear indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we have drawn to a close. Our coverage comes to an end. Thank you for our distinguished guests for being with us. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Our special coverages continue day by day. So bye for now.